welcome back to the channel! On today's episode, Astro Boy, Omega Factor. Why does no one talk about this? Astro Boy Omega Factor is a side-scrolling beat-em-up that was co-developed exclusively for the Game Boy Advance by Treasure and Hitmaker. Despite Astro Boy having existed in Japanese pop culture for several decades, Astro Boy was new to North America, and Tezuka Productions, a production company with the sole purpose of managing the intellectual properties of Osamu Tezuka, was hoping Omega Factor would be their way into the substantial and dominant North American market. They aimed to do this by coinciding the release of the game with the release of the TV series aptly named Astro Boy.
It's genius, right?
Even delaying the game to ensure the release dates lined up. Before we get into it, I know some of you watching may be unfamiliar with Astro Boy, so I'll quickly fill you in. Astro Boy is a humanoid robot that protects humanity and saves the Earth on several occasions. But despite Astro's high spirits and positivity, his origin is nothing short of heartbreaking. He was created out of mourning by a man named Dr. Tenma, a talented robotics professor whose son Tobio had recently passed away. Lost in an unimaginable depression and guided by sorrow, Tenma designed a robot in the image of his son and imprinted his memories on the android with the hope he could see him once again and still have a father's privilege of watching his son grow up and grow old. While Astro filled that void for a moment, Tenma's hope abandoned him quicker than it had appeared the second he realized androids lacked the ability to age. This sent him in a rapid downward spiral, leading him to the abandonment of Astro, his career, and his life without question or hesitation, wallowing in the reality that his son was gone. Omega Factor picks the story up from here.
Finally awake.
With Astro Boy being rescued by his eventual father figure, Dr. O'Shea, whom we are introduced to as gameplay begins and the controls and mechanics are explained. When it comes to basic combat, he tells us that we can both punch and kick enemies, and if things get a little sticky, instead of a block or a dodge, you can opt to use your jet engines to avoid an attack and navigate maps.
They fresh out the box.
And lastly, that as we bare knuckle box the Chuckle Five Nights at Freddy's Rejects, ooh, what is that? What is that? What is that? What is that? We fill up our EX bar, a resource that, when filled, powers your choice of 3 special attacks. The first of those powers is EX Dash. Astro travels across the screen, punching and pushing enemies as he does so, which can be useful in situations where you're outnumbered by a large margin. The second special attack is what I call Anti-Artillery, where he spins around on the spot, stunning and damaging all enemies on screen, while also absorbing all projectiles in the process. And the last power is my personal favorite, his Pulse Cannon, which deals significant damage to all enemies caught in its path while also absorbing projectiles that interact with it. It's the power I personally recommend to level up first, but we'll get to that. All you need to know right now is it does
tons of damage.
This is when Dr. O'Shea lets us in on what makes Astro special, and more specifically, this game. His Omega Factor.
They said the title.
As you play the game, Astro will meet new people and connect with them, causing them to imprint on his soul, which allows him to grow stronger, and you as a player to level up one of 6 stats. Those stats being your life, punch, laser, your shot, jets, and your sensor, all of which we'll discuss in a second. While it sounds a bit nonsensical and change for the sake of standing out, to stray from the set standards for leveling and progression in this genre of game, I do argue in its defense that this gives Omega Factor a feeling of originality in what you could realistically argue is a run-of-the-mill game for a handheld. And while you could argue that, you'd have a hard time selling the jury and me, because it's much more than this that breathes life into Omega Factor. Much, much more. Omega Factor begins the second you drop in from the sky after completing the tutorial. If you skip the tutorial, no you didn't, but if you did, I recommend you go back and quickly play it through because you get rewarded with a free stat point for maybe a minute and a half of your time. Big worth. And when it does come to leveling your stats specifically, I have recommendations on what I think you should level up first, though I feel this is going to vary from person to person based exclusively on how you like to play. I enjoy a much more run and gun playstyle that sacrifices efficiency for chaos. So what I recommend may not be for you, and that's Laser Prio. This is because for every point that you put on it, not only does its damage increase, you also increase its width, making it easier to hit enemies. With that, I recommend a 1-to-1 back and forth balance between spending points on your punch and your HP. With your punch, it just increases your punch damage and nothing else, and with your HP, take a guess. I use the Machine Gun Artillery Special as support exclusively to clear the screen of projectiles or stun enemies that are boxing me in, so its priority is low given points only really up its damage, and I would much rather use my EX bar to use the pulse cannon over the machine gun. Jets is my personal dump stat, where I'll toss a point on it if I'm finding I need it, because points only add 1 to the total amount of dashes you can perform in succession before you have to touch grass to reset. And I find you don't usually need more than 2 or 3 dashes tops for the majority of the game, so once you put 1 or 2 points into it, that's all you need. Sensor is so useless, the game begs you not to waste points on it. For your first playthrough, you really only need 1 point just to make sure you have dark vision so you can see in dark tunnels, and that's it. You can honestly ignore it until you reach the post game, because that's when it really begins to prove its usefulness. But like I said, do literally anything other than sensor prio, and you're gonna have a blast playing this game, because that's just it. This game is fun. It offers both an incredibly relaxing and incredibly challenging experience, all packed within a stylistic 16-bit package that both a casual gamer and a Souls-like fan could enjoy. Yes, a Souls-like fan, because when asked, this game has no trouble showing you how high its ceilings really are, and they get pretty high. It's especially insane how difficult they made Omega Factor when you consider the fact this game was marketed exclusively and entirely for children, North American children. Have they met North American children? I remember us getting stuck in Pokemon Red because we couldn't get past Victory Road.
Yeah, this isn't humanly possible.
But looking back, I'm thankful that they chose to add such an extreme level of difficulty, because it's made going back to play the game much more fun than I expected it to be. And while there are some bosses that may seem impossible for one reason or another, and you may or may not definitely spend a significant amount of time trying to defeat a boss, every boss has either a blatant or subtle weakness that once exposed will have you cursing yourself for not realizing it sooner. For example, the majority of my attempts at this specific boss that you see on screen was spent on trying to figure out the first phase, which should take you no longer than 35 seconds. Took me an hour 20, but the sense of pride and accomplishment I now felt was worth it on its own. Personally, I wouldn't recommend it unless you specifically enjoy climbing extremely steep hills when you could just walk downhill and enjoy it all the same. You don't ever need to bother with the hard difficulty where this level of challenge lies. The normal experience is just challenging enough to prevent the game from feeling childishly easy, but not so difficult you're ever gonna want to completely give up. You can enjoy the game all the same without having to torture yourself until you get to that boss, or 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 that, and you'll heavily consider lighting your copy on fire. But I promise you, take your time and pay attention to how they move and when they attack. It'll get easier with every attempt until inevitably you do move forward. And as for moving forward, general progression of the game is the closest Omega Factor ever gets to being generic. The game plays out over 7 linear stages consisting of 32 levels with a handful of secret levels you'll discover as you play, and realistically takes no more than a couple hours to play, factoring in successive attempts. If you choose to play the game to completion, you may also discover the possibility actually does exist secret level with the hidden true ending.
Repeat after me. There is no cow level.
And the path to get there is loaded with incentive to continue pressing on and actually playing this game to completion. Combat is crunchy and altogether satisfying. Visuals, effects, animations are absolutely stunning, and the story is enough to make you want to continue after some levels leave you feeling defeated. The narrative, while simple, is a fun twist on traditional storytelling in games where the outcome may not be what you expect. After you've played the game once over, the narrative continues into the post-game, elaborating on what I already consider a well-told story. And especially when, at its heart, it's a story that speaks to humanity's desire to discriminate rather than celebrate the things that make each of us unique, I can't help but recommend playing through the game for the story alone. It shouldn't matter whether you're human or robot, you deserve to live in freedom and peace. Obviously, I recommend playing through Omega Factor, but do I recommend spending any money on it to experience as it was originally intended? That depends. Given this game was released exclusively on the GBA, you're heavily limited to how many ways you can play it. 1. And controllers of that size aren't for everybody, and unless you conveniently have a working GBA player disc and GameCube, I don't think there's any reason to bother buying this game if you're just looking to play it. I personally did play this on a Game Boy Advance, and I thoroughly enjoyed it, but unless you have an attachment to the franchise or seek specifically to collect Game Boy Advance or beat-em-up games, there's nothing a Game Boy Advance is gonna offer you that VisualBoy Advance won't. And especially if you have an ROG Ally or Steam Deck, this is a fantastic game to have saved somewhere to pick up and put down if you ever needed something quick to play. It runs incredibly smooth without any setup whatsoever, and if you so choose, you can smooth out the graphics to further improve the visual experience. Now, if you're a collector, I do think there's a bit of value in owning a physical copy. This is the first Astro Boy game made for the North American market. Astro Boy as an IP was incredibly influential to the early manga scene, and this is, in my opinion, one of the best Game Boy Advance games ever released, and it's only $54.